Hello and welcome back to the Why We Write Fantasy podcast. My name is Oscar Cesena.
And I'm KJ Aiello. And today we have an amazing episode for you. We've been talking a lot before about bigger worlds and bigger ideas and concepts. Now we're going to kind of narrow our focus a little bit. We're still within world building, but we're going to kind of take that and turn it a little bit sideways in talking about small worlds and big characters.
And just to add to that, like we've been talking in the past couple of episodes about like Lord of the Rings style
Yeah.
world building, Brandon Sanderson, like the big ones that make
Mhm.
amazing worlds and continents and everything. This time we're just doing it smaller, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And really, is this technically world building? Is it not? And this is the amazing thing about writing techniques, about genres, about literature itself, is that it's constantly evolving. So, what we're going to be talking about tonight is more of the interior worlds that our characters build. And what I mean by that is more of like a liminal or an intrusive fantasy, but they're really great if you're a fantasy writer. They can be separate but also work together. Liminal fantasy is like thinking of liminality, of the in between, where your character could reside in an in between. It can be a literal in between place, or it could be they kind of float between worlds. And that could be a world in reality versus non-reality. It could be our world versus a fantasy world, but its premise, the story is premised around that in-between space, the liminality of it. Intrusive fantasy isolates the character as well as the reader. So the character is experiencing magical happenings or magical creatures or whatever the case may be, but no one else around them can see this. So the character is completely isolated. And the reader is also usually receiving this information from the character's perspective. So they're feeling slightly isolated from the rest of the characters in the book as well. Anyways, that's like a really your quick
Yeah,
synopsis of what these small worlds, big characters are. And it's basically the world is built around the character's psyche, that sort of
right.
thing, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I think it makes sense, and just thinking about like magical realism, there's a lot of overlap between that one and
Yeah.
liminal fantasy. Like I think about like the classics in magical realism, like Hundred Years of Solitude, or like other like Pedro Paramo, there's
Mhm.
in Mexico, or Aura, like Carlos Fuentes. Like I think
Mhm.
about the ones that I had to read in high school because that was part of the curricula. But thinking it has usually has like a setting that it's our world, but it's like a little overlap between that.
Mhm.
They have some
Yeah.
magical elements, but the magic is usually left very like unexplained. Like you don't
Mhm.
really know what's going on. It's just that it's there. Just not a lot of information, and I think part of that is the idea that by the when you finish reading, you're not really sure
Mhm.
if the character was actually thinking about it, like imagining it, was it a dream or what actually happened? And it's
Yeah.
one of the things that make me think of every time when I hear the term like liminal fantasy. Is like, well, why don't we just call it like magical realism as we should, in my point of view, right? Besides that, okay, so we just explained a little bit of what is liminal fantasy, what is intrusive
Mhm.
fantasy, and what is magical realism, a little bit on how they overlap.
Mhm.
But KJ, you have more experience writing like this,
Yeah.
like thinking about like interiority and all those things.
Yeah.
When you're writing, like your book, even if
Mhm.
the book you're publishing or something else, like how do you approach it?
I think the wonderful thing about these types of fantasy is that first of all, you already have the architecture of a world anyways, like both physically, like geographically, you can set it in our world and you could set it in another world too. But also it's more of the character's psyche and their psychology and human behaviors. And we have a lot of information about, what typical human behaviors are like, even if somebody is living with mental illness or mental unwellness or neurodiversity. So being able to approaching intrusive or liminal fantasy, you definitely wouldn't start building your world. What you would do is start building your characters' motivations, their wants. Like, why is it they're doing what they are doing? But what is it that's stopping them from actually achieving what they need to achieve. And it's usually in this kind of case, it's
Hmm.
themselves stopping them, right? There's something in their own psyche that is stopping them from moving forward.
It's one of the things I like about this type of fantasy, that it leaves you with it could be like a completely different interpretation of
Yeah.
the story, and I kind
Yeah.
of like that. Like, I think I'm trying to moving like out of like Latin American authors that I know
Mhm.
that a lot of people might not be familiar with. Like, I think about like Neil Gaiman with
Yeah.
the Ocean at the End of the Lane. I think it was
Yes.
called.
Yeah, the ocean at
Um,
the end of the
yeah,
lane.
well, that one for me, it's magical realism totally. And I know, like doing a little bit of the research, there are some publications that actually talk about it as magical realism,
Right.
but I think it will also land in the liminal fantasy side based on what
Yeah.
you're saying.
Yeah, it could be both liminal and intrusive fantasy, and this is the amazing thing about these types of fantasy is that you can have both. They don't have to be exclusive,
Right.
right? So the character can live in this in between, but also feel this intrusion and feel isolated, and but they don't entirely know what's true or not. And as
Hmm.
well, we, the reader, don't really know what's true or not. And those wonderful interpretations actually teach us a lot, particularly as writers. It's like, oh, that's amazing. Because even as a writer, you don't necessarily need to know exactly what's going on. You know,
Hmm.
you can trust that your reader is going to take their own interpretation, and you don't need to to cater to that in any way. You don't need to force any interpretation,
Right.
right? Yeah.
So, and I think I mean, we just gave a few examples of it, and you're talking a little bit about how to write it. And we know, like, you and I both read Piranesi just a couple of
Yeah.
weeks
Yeah.
ago. Um, and I think that one lands in the same way, like, because you and I were talking about it, and like my interpretation, like in the beginning, one of the things that happened is that, without like giving a lot of spoilers, is that I thought that Piranesi was like in a mental institution,
Yeah.
and he was imagining a lot of things, and your interpretation was different
Yeah.
in the beginning, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But it's
totally
one of
different.
the, yeah, exactly. And I think it's one of the really cool things, that something that is more like you're building the world in the heads of the characters allow you to write,
Yes.
then, like, going back to what we were talking last week, is that we have, like, let's say, Middle Earth, the Lord of the Rings.
Mhm.
There's not a lot of room for interpretation, right? The
Yeah,
Rivendell is there, and
yeah,
that's the way it is. There's not a lot of room for the reader
yeah,
to to get it in a different way, unless you're reading it wrong, of course. But in
yeah.
this case, when you have this world in the character's mind, it's open, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly, and for the writer too, it's completely open. There are a lot less rules when we're talking about these small worlds, big characters, intrusive and liminal fantasy and magical realism. There are a lot less rules that we need to follow because let's be real, there are not a lot of rules that our subconscious, our psyches follow, right? Like there's, you could be in a dream world and not being able to run or, when you're being chased or, the strangest things happen. Well, you can also create as in the case of Piranesi, this house, and it's called a
Hmm.
house, like proper noun house, with thousands and thousands and thousands of hallways. It's just infinite,
Yeah.
but it also has an ocean trapped inside. Like that just doesn't make sense, right? But I love that your first interpretation was that he was in, a psychiatric hospital.
Yeah.
I thought that he was actually kidnapped, and this is where his brain actually the world that his brain created in order to be able to cope with the trauma he was undergoing. But
Hmm.
then I learned very recently that Susanna Clarke, the author of the book, she actually wrote that just as she came out of a severe major depressive episode.
Mm.
So now there you can also see the influences. But
Yeah.
we're all right. Whatever the interpretation is of it, we are all right. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's amazing.
It is, and especially if you're okay with, like, not having like this a lot of the things explained in the world.
Hmm.
Like, it's not my like, I know, like, you loved it, and for me it was like, it's okay.
Yeah.
But it's mostly because I like, for example, magic. I like the rules of magic explained. Like, how does magic work? Tell me,
Yeah.
because that's what I like. Like, show me a map. I want to see
Hmm.
that. And in cases like this one, it's just completely different. Like, you're never going to see a map or magic explained. Magic happens, and magic
Yeah.
is something that maybe sometimes, most of the time, the character doesn't even understand how it's happening. And I think
Yeah.
that's part of the again, the interiority you were saying, but like a really interesting way in to build the world, like this small world in the character's mind,
Mhm.
build it through the story.
Yeah, exactly. And when you kind of look at it, from a meta perspective, this is the biggest world that we can possibly build is that it's taking our own psychology and our behaviors and what makes us tick and blowing it wide and creating an entire world from that, right? If
Hmm.
and what do they believe that is, opposite to in juxtaposition with reality, and I'm air quoting here, because reality is very
It's perception. Yeah.
it's totally perception, right?
Yeah.
And this is another amazing I get so excited about this. Um, so you have to define who your character is. You need to know their motivations, you need to know their backstory. See, your world building is all about your character building. But from there, that's the world that you end up building because it is in your character's head, is their subjective, very subjective experience, right?
Right. And I like what you said about character building, because I mean, you can have an amazing world, but if
Mhm.
you don't have an interesting character that drives the story,
Oh, yeah.
it's not going to be a good book. It's going to
Yeah.
be a campaign setting for
Yeah.
RPG. I think about it, like I think about the worlds that I like besides the one that I've read. Like a lot of
Mhm.
the RPGs that I play, they have amazing worlds,
Mhm.
but then it's just a world, and they leave me to create the story.
Yeah.
But I think in this case it's the total opposite. Like there's no world, you just create the story, and you create the world for this person, and
Yeah.
I find it fascinating as well.
Yeah. Yeah, look at something like, Life of Pi, Jan Martel's Life of Pi, and, even the movie too. That's an excellent example of intrusive fantasy. Now, I'm not gonna, like, give too much away because I feel if I explain even a little bit of it, I give it all away, but
I
basically
find if you do it, like it came, like the
I'm gonna
book
do
has
a little
been,
bit.
and I think the movie came out like what, like 10 years ago.
If you
Like
haven't watched it
if you
yet,
haven't
that's
watched
on
it, then
you.
it's your
That's
fault.
on you.
Yeah.
Totally. Okay. So basically, this kid, he's going from India to, I think it's the Americas or England or something, and he's on a boat, and the boat, they end up in a storm, and he is the only one left on this little rowboat in the middle of, I think it's the
Hmm.
South Pacific Ocean in the middle. And basically, he's on this tiny boat with like a gorilla, there's a hyena, there's a tiger. I can't remember, but basically it's a matter of survival with him both surviving the elements and no
Yeah.
water, but also surviving these animals. But are the animals really animals?
Yeah.
Is I'm just going to leave it at that because it's how he it's how he was able to cope with retelling the story once he was rescued. The
Yeah.
only way he could retell the story, something that was so traumatic for him, was by creating this fantasy. But he knew, and this is the interesting about this story too, is that he knew full well what he was doing, but he
Hmm.
had to do it. It was the only way he could.
Yeah.
I think that's incredible, and I think that's some really intelligent writing,
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
know.
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as you
It's a
said,
good
like,
book.
yeah, I haven't read the book,
You
to
should.
be completely honest. I should, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think in the movie, the it actually captures it pretty well.
Really
Like,
well.
yeah,
Yeah, the movie's
I
really
think
good.
it's harder to do in a movie than in a book. Like in a
Yeah.
book, you leave a lot for the reader to imagine. Like I think about why do I always keep back going to Lord of the Rings? I don't
It's
know.
okay. It
It's
just go what you feel. It's
yeah.
where your
Okay,
heart
so
is. Do
let's
it.
say the Lord of the Rings. Like I remember when I was reading when they go into Moria,
Yeah.
I had Moria in my head. Like I knew
Yeah.
how it was, and when they found like the orcs and the troll and the Balrog and all that,
Mhm.
I have it there. But I think when I saw it in the movies, was like, okay, it's not exactly how I thought about it, but it's really cool,
Mm.
and I think they
Yeah.
were able to do it pretty well. But I
Yeah.
think, and I think one of the things that happens is that if you're writing and you need your character at a stadium and then at an airport, that's fine. You just write an airport and a stadium, and that's it.
Mhm.
When you're producing a movie, then you need to pay for whatever you're doing in
Mhm.
the airport, the stadium. So it becomes a little harder. So I think the fact that
Mhm.
they did it this well in Life of Pi,
Oh, yeah.
I think it's just really really amazing, right? It's
Yeah,
it's a,
you're
it's a it's a I mean, we talk about writing. It's mostly books because that's what we like, but we also talk about writing like TV shows, movies,
mhm.
um, graphic novels, so those things. So I think the writing there was actually really good.
It was
It's
really good, yeah, it's cinematography, cinegraphically, that's the word. I am a writer. I think you're right, because it really captured this, like, mystical, magical element to the story with, the colors and
yeah,
the sounds, the music. It was just absolutely stunning. It was a very magical movie,
yeah,
but at all times, it was very tense. You knew
yeah.
that danger was lurking right on the boat.
Yes,
Right
yes,
on the boat.
yeah, yeah. Then
Yeah.
and I think another now you're saying that I think the hardest part I think is the interiority in a movie because
Yes.
in a book you can be inside
Mhm.
the character's head. In the
Yeah.
movie you can't.
You
So
can't.
it's really good. Yeah.
Yeah, you lose a lot of that in the movie, and they did really well there. And that's the thing too about this type of fantasy, liminal and intrusive fantasy, is there's so much interiority. And this is why you need to know your character through and through, because you also need to write your character from their perspective, knowing full well that their perspective might actually be very skewed.
And I think this is a great question for you because you
Mhm.
you like reading this, you like writing this
Yeah.
more than I do. In like we were talking about like how we can bring this worlds, and you said
Mhm.
like well we're talking about building them from the character's perspective.
Mhm.
You need to understand your character. You need to know what they're thinking, what they're doing. In practice, how would you do it? Like, is there any like a couple of tips for our listeners?
I mean, I don't know, like, I eat, sleep, breathe my characters. Like, it's all I think, become obsessed. No, let's think practically here. I think, like, there is a lot of thinking, just a lot of thinking that you need to do, but there's also some practical exercises that you can do too. So you can actually like write a letter to your character or write a letter from your character. You could write random scenes with your character in it that may or may not go in the novel. Just pick a random scene and see
Yeah,
how your character reacts to. This type of fantasy is very much, I think, the plantsers, the not pantsers, not plotters, but the plantsers are definitely going to be like, this is me. Um,
they're gonna enjoy this part.
yeah, because your character is gonna be telling you the story, right? So, the more you write your character, the more you're gonna understand them. But I also think that really fleshing out your character's backstory and what that did to them. Right. So maybe your character comes from a broken home and not a blended family that, is functional, that sort of thing, but a completely dysfunctional childhood. Okay. There are a lot of people who come from that kind of a background, but how did this impact your character? What are the subtle ways that it impacted your character? So you really have to start thinking about psychology and human behavior, right? And maybe even talk to some people, do some research, that sort of thing. But I think that, like, there's a lot of back end work that you need to do
Yeah.
before you can really start to set them on their way. But don't ever not write. I think you
Right.
just always need to write.
Always.
Yeah.
There's one that I do, and I think it's aligned to what you're doing, and I do it for not only my protagonist, but I do it for secondary characters, and I do it for everyone who has some impact in the story. Is that I write their origin story. That's kind of hard. So what I do is like, yeah, I just like to write like what happened to them at some point in their lives that made them who they are now. And it might not be like a massive thing. It's usually one scene or maybe a couple of scenes that I write, but I try to get into the character's mind. Like you said, it might be a broken home, it might be something different, but there's something that, I mean, again, like if we think about the human mind, it might be a little more than that. It's not just one event that changes you, but maybe there's an event that changes you in the end. Maybe there's a process, right? But I think you're able to write even that little scene. For me, it helps me a lot. It helps me a lot to understand the characters and how they will react in the story and how they will react with my protagonist or something like that. So I think that's also a really good exercise that people can do.
Yeah, when you were
I
saying
enjoy
that
it a lot.
yeah, I mean, I know you do. This is but also I think that you recommended this book to me, I can't remember, but it's a fantastic book, Lisa Cron's Story Genius.
Yes,
Yeah, did I don't know
I
if you
did. Yes.
you did, yes, so I got it and I read I think it's the first time I've ever done that with Oscar, but, so she basically talks about, the main, plot, what your character is pushing against, but she also talks about the third rail, and the third rail, and I might get this wrong, being what is the through line? Like, um, what is your character really about? Right? So with each scene that you write, you need to have this third rail happening and read the book because I'm not explaining it very well.
Yeah,
But that's what this
but
reminds
it's
me
really good.
of.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So that's actually a really great place to start as well, is
yeah.
reading Lisa Cron's Story Genius, in order to be able to write this type of fantasy and build this interior world. Because the interior world in liminal and intrusive fantasy becomes the exterior.
Right. I think this was a really great introduction to world building in a different
Yeah,
perspective. It's not just like it's not actually creating these massive worlds and maps and rules and how magic works, even though I love that.
yeah,
But in this type of different type of fantasy, we can just think about what it's inside the person, and I think
yeah,
that's a really good introduction. And I think it will prepare our listeners to when we start talking about character development
yeah,
and all those things.
yeah. It all works together.
It does, yeah.
It does.
So before we close this, as always, we're going to talk about quickly on what are
S
we reading right now. So KJ, you
Yes.
begin. What are you reading?
I am reading, and this is a really good book, The Daughter of Doctor Moreau by Silvia Moreno Garcia. She is a Canadian Mexican. I believe she's Canadian. Um, author. She's got a couple of novels out, and this is, I think, like maybe her third or fourth. It
Hmm.
is so good. It's like a loosely inspired on the island of Doctor Moreau, but it's basically like one of his hybrid daughters. It's such a good book. It's so good. I like her as a writer, anyways. How about
Perfect.
you? What are you reading?
I am rereading something that I read when I was young. It's Ursula K. Le Guin,
Yes.
the books of Earthsea. I'm actually reading right now. Well, it's such a short book. Like the first one, like the Wizard of Earthsea, is like 130 pages only of this
Yeah.
massive tome. But this is a special edition, and I love it. It's one of the books that I read when I was starting with fantasy. I think it's more targeted to like young readers.
Mhm, it's YA.
Yeah, XYA, but again, like back in my time in Mexico, I we didn't have a lot of fantasy options in Spanish. They weren't translated. I'm talking about
Mhm,
like early '90s, so it wasn't that much. But I had like Tolkien, I had the classics like Lewin, all those things. And I remember I loved the book. So I got this special edition and I'm going through the first one because I just want to reread it again. And something
nice.
that I guess everybody, not everybody, but most people who love fantasy at least know that it exists. And I would recommend just
Mhm,
read it. It's a lot of world building. It's a really good magic system, and there's a lot of character development. Like the character, the wizard Ged, he's flawed. Like he's not like a perfect character. He's flawed. Like
yeah.
actually, the I would say I'm might not be remembering correctly, but I remember there was something that happened. He used magic and then he created kind of the villain. Like
Oh,
I might be wrong, but it's
okay.
a mistake that he makes that actually propels the story into the antagonist.
Oh, that's
So
awesome.
he's a really flawed character,
Yeah,
but it's a really, yeah. I'm reading that, rereading it. I think everybody should read. It's
yeah.
130 pages. It's pretty short. Like you can finish it in an afternoon. So I might do that today.
Do
Actually,
it.
finish
I
it.
still have not read Ursula K. Le Guin, and I feel like such a fake fantasy fan. Like, I'm
Well,
so fake.
I think the difference, and I just said this. Like in my case, like we didn't have a lot of fantasy. Most of
Yeah,
the fantasy authors that I wanted to read, they only wrote in English, and those books didn't arrive in Mexico. So
yeah,
we had the ones that were translated. We didn't have a lot of English literature. I mean, it's different now. There's you can find anything anywhere in
yeah,
Mexico City, but back then, early '90s, it was mostly in like mostly if not everything was in Spanish,
yeah.
and only if it had been translated. So I didn't have a lot of options. I remember I read The Lord of the Rings. I went to the bookstore and say, "Hey,
I
I
want
just read
more.
The Lord of the Rings. What can I read now?"
Oh, that's so
And
sweet.
the dude there, and I think I was like, what? Like he was 15,
Oh, I
14.
love it.
And the dude there was like, you know what? Read this one. So I remember I purchased them like three little books, like three
Yeah.
independent books that I read in maybe a week, and
Oh,
then
I
I
love
went
it.
back and kept asking about more
Ah.
fantasy until like I think I had covered everything that was translated at the time.
Oh,
But
I love it. That's
yeah,
such a good story. You kept going back. What else you got for me?
yeah, it was. I
I
mean,
love it.
again, yeah, I
Yeah.
lived really close to the bookstore, so it was pretty easy for me to get there. But anyway, okay, cool. KJ, before we wrap this up, anything else that we didn't talk about today? I think we talked about everything that we
I
wanted
think
to
we
talk
got
about.
everything in. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, there's gonna be a lot more happening this season and even next season. There's so much to writing about fantasy, and this is why we have a podcast because there's
Yes.
so much.
Like it.
I love it.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone who's listening. Make sure to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening to this as a podcast, make sure you subscribe on any um, podcast app that you use to listen to us, either Apple
Yeah.
Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and all that.
Yeah, and look for us on Instagram at Why We Write Fantasy. Send us a message. Use the hashtag WWWF and with whatever your thoughts, pictures, your writing. We would love to see it. Thank you so much.
Until next time.